Look, there is a man buried inside a list of names that most people skim on their way to the next chapter. No backstory, no miracles, no army, just one verse, one prayer. And yet, something about it stopped the scribes cold enough to write it down. What did Jabez know that everyone around him had already forgotten? 1 Chronicles chapter 4 is not exactly where most people go for a devotional. It is a genealogy. 40 verses of names, begat this one, begat that one, the kind of passage you speed read to feel like you finished your Bible plan for the day, and then right there in the middle of it, sandwiched between men whose names we cannot even pronounce, there is Jabez. 2 verses, that is all he gets. But those 2 verses have outlasted every name around him. The text does not waste time. It says simply, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. That is a remarkable thing to say about a man in a genealogy list. It means something set him apart, not his position, not his inheritance, not his connections. Something in the way he lived, something in the way he prayed, and we are about to find out what it was. But before we get there, you need to understand what his name meant. Because in the ancient Hebrew world, your name was not just what people called you. It was a declaration. It was a theology. It was a prophecy spoken over you before you could even speak back. And the name Jabez, it meant pain. His mother named him Pain because, as the text says, she bore him with great sorrow. Think about what that means. From his first breath, this man carried the weight of someone else's grief as his identity. Every time his name was spoken, at dinner, in the marketplace, across the field, someone was saying the word pain out loud. He was the child of sorrow. And in a culture where names shaped destiny, that was not a small thing. That was a sentence. But here is where the story takes a turn no one expects. Jabez refused to let someone else's pain define his future. We do not know the details of what his life looked like. The Bible does not give us a backstory the way we want it to. But we know this. At some point, Jabez opened his mouth and prayed, and what he prayed was not a polished religious speech. It was a cry. It was raw and specific and desperate in the best possible way. He said, "Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me, and that you would keep me from evil, so that I will be free from pain." 1 Chronicles 4:10, 4 requests, 1 breath, and the text says, God granted what he asked. Now, some people read this prayer and immediately spiritualize it into vagueness. Bless me means something nice will happen. Enlarge my territory means I will feel more at peace. But that is not what Jabez was praying. He was asking for more land, more responsibility, more influence, more of whatever God had decided to put in front of him, and he was asking for it by name. Here is the question I want you to sit with for a moment, and be honest with yourself before we keep going. Have you ever stopped praying for big things because it felt selfish, because it felt presumptuous, because somewhere along the way someone told you that wanting more was the same thing as being greedy? Jabez did not think so, and God did not treat it as arrogance. He answered it. But that is not the part that should surprise you. The part that should stop you is this. Jabez was praying in the shadow of a name that said he would never be anything but someone else's sorrow, and he prayed anyway. He did not wait until his life felt different. He did not wait until his name was changed. He opened his mouth from inside the pain and asked God to move, and God did. This is where the story shifts from biography to theology, because the prayer of Jabez is not just a success story, it is a confrontation with a lie that most of us have believed at some level, the lie that our origin determines our ceiling, that where we started is where we are going, that the wounds we were born into or born near are the limits of what God can do with us. The genealogy of 1 Chronicles is full of people who lived and died between the lines, men whose names appear once and vanish, not because their lives did not matter, but because they never asked. They accepted the name. They stayed inside the story someone else had written for them. Jabez did something different. Jabez interrupted the list, and here is what I want you to see in this. God's response to Jabez was not delayed, it was not qualified. The text does not say, and God considered his request. It says, and God granted what he asked. That is the kind of sentence that should shake something loose in you if you have been praying the same prayer for what feels like too long and wondering if it is being heard at all. The ancient rabbis noted that Jabez appears in a list of scribes and men of learning. Some scholars believe he was a teacher, someone who shaped the minds of others. If that is true, then enlarge my territory was not about land at all. It was about influence, about reach, about the capacity to pour into more lives than he currently could. He was not praying for comfort, he was praying for assignment. That reframe matters for us today, because when was the last time you prayed not for less pressure, but for more capacity, not for the burden to be lifted, but for the strength to carry something bigger? Jabez did not ask God to make his life easier, he asked God to make his life larger, and there is a difference. And before we keep going, a quick word. These videos exist because people watch them, share them, and partner with us to keep them going. If this channel has been part of your walk with God, consider becoming a member. You keep this content free for someone in the world tonight who needs it and cannot afford anything else. We don't take that lightly. Thank you to our members already partnering with us. You are in every video. Now, that your hand would be with me. This is the third part of the prayer, and I think it is the hinge the whole thing turns on. Because Jabez was not asking for results without presence, he was not asking for the outcome without the author. He knew that bigger territory without God's hand was just more ground to get lost in. He wanted God in it with him. This is the part of the prayer most people skip in the famous summaries. We fixate on the blessing and the territory, but the hand of God, the felt, active, present guidance of the Almighty, that was the center of it. Jabez was not asking for a transaction. He was asking for accompaniment. He wanted to be the kind of man who could not move without God moving with him. And then the final request, keep me from evil so that I will be free from pain. Now the prayer comes full circle. His name was pain, the very thing his mother embedded into his identity at birth. He placed it before God and said, I do not want to carry this anymore. Keep me from the evil that produces it. Deliver me from the pattern. Break the cycle that named me before I had a voice. That is not a small prayer. That is generational. That is the kind of prayer a person prays when they have looked at their family line and decided, it stops with me. Not in bitterness, not in pride, but in desperate, humble, specific faith that God is actually able to interrupt what has always been, and God granted it. The text does not elaborate. It does not give us the story of how Jabez's territory grew or what his life looked like afterward. It simply says, granted. As if the response itself was more important than the details of what followed. As if God wanted to make sure we understood that the prayer worked, and then let us sit with that. That silence after the answer is significant, because we are always looking for the full story, the before and after photos, the testimony with all the details. But sometimes God answers and does not give you the highlight reel of how he did it. He just gives you the result, and he asks you to trust that the how was his business, not yours. One verse, one prayer, one answer. And then Jabez disappears from the text as quickly as he appeared. But the scribes wrote him down in the middle of a list that was supposed to be about everyone else. They stopped and wrote about the man who dared to ask for more, and 2,500 years later we are still talking about him. Step back from the story for a moment, because I think God put Jabez in the middle of that genealogy list on purpose, not at the beginning, not at the end. Right in the middle of all the names that history forgot, like a signal flare in the middle of the ordinary. Like God was saying, this is what it looks like when someone refuses to stay invisible. Most of us are living inside a genealogy. We have names that were spoken over us before we could speak back. Broken, forgotten, too much, not enough, damaged, difficult, behind, stuck. Some of those names came from people who loved us and were just in their own pain. Some came from people who had no idea what they were doing, but they stuck. And a lot of us have never thought to bring them specifically by name before God and say, this is what I was called, but is this what you call me? Jabez prayed with specificity. Not God bless me somehow eventually if you want to. He named what he wanted. He named what he feared. He named the very thing that had defined him and placed it directly before the throne. That kind of prayer requires something most of us are not always comfortable with. It requires believing that God is actually interested in the details of your life, not just the big spiritual arc of it. And it requires courage. Because the moment you pray for more, you are also agreeing that more is possible. And sometimes the thing standing between you and the prayer of Jabez is not your faith in God's ability. It is your belief in your own eligibility. You believe he can. You are not sure he will. For you, with your name, with your history, with everything that happened between your beginning and right now. Jabez believed he would. That is the whole story. One man who decided that his name was not his destiny. One prayer that reached past the ceiling of his circumstances and grabbed hold of something larger than his own limitations. And God, who had Jabez's name written down in heaven long before it was written in a genealogy list, said yes. The story of Jabez is not just about a man who got a blessing. It is about the audacity of specific faith. It is about what happens when someone who has every reason to stay small decides to ask big. And God is still doing this today, responding to the prayers of people who look like they have no business asking for more and granting what they asked for anyway. The genealogy in 1 Chronicles does not stop to explain anyone else. It moves through names like water through a channel. But Jabez made it pause. Not because of what he achieved, not because of his lineage, but because of what he said to God in private. That is worth thinking about. The records of heaven are not filled with the names of the most famous, they are filled with the names of the most faithful. You do not need a platform, you do not need a position, you do not need your circumstances to change before you pray. You need what Jabez had, the conviction that God hears, the courage to ask specifically, and the willingness to believe that pain is not the final word on your life, even when it has been your name for as long as you can remember. So here is the question I want to leave with you tonight. What have you stopped asking for? What territory, in your family, in your calling, in your influence, in your healing, have you quietly pulled back from because it started to feel too large, too far, too much like wanting something God probably wasn't going to give you? And what would happen if you prayed it anyway, specifically, tonight, by name? Jabez did not have a spiritual resume. He had a painful name and a decision. He decided that the God who put breath in his lungs was the same God who could put something entirely new in his future. He prayed from inside the pain, not after it, and that is what God honored. You do not have to wait until your life feels less like a genealogy and more like a highlight reel. You can ask from right where you are. If this story moved something in you, share it with one person this week who needs to hear that their name is not their destiny. And subscribe, because next week we are going somewhere in Scripture that most people walk past even faster than they walk past Jabez. And what we find there might be even more surprising. Next time, we look at a moment in the Old Testament where God asks someone a question he already knows the answer to. Not because he needed information, but because he needed the person to hear themselves say it out loud. That video drops soon. Do not miss it. Tell me in the comments, are you more like someone who has been praying the prayer of Jabez or someone who has been afraid to ask? I want to know where you are right now.